Welcome to section 3 of lecture 8, where we're examining Jesus' teachings about the age to come, which he gave while in Jerusalem. Just like in our day, in Jesus' day everyone was waiting for the coming of God's kingdom, for the end of the current age and the start of the new glorious one in which God would rule forever with his people in his place. Everyone was hoping that it would be coming very soon, and everyone had their own theories of what that would look like and who would be the person or people who would usher in that kingdom. Also, just as today, it seems that whenever someone says end of days, people go nuts and start making up all sorts of crazy ideas based on very scant information. Certainly, they thought the Messiah would be a king from the line of David, or some people thought that there would be a king and a priest ruling. Also, they thought the Messiah would free the Jews from the Romans in order to establish his own kingdom on earth. Also, that the dead would be raised, maybe, depending on your school of thought, and that there would be judgment, maybe, and then maybe only the Gentiles. As you can see, lots of different ideas. And of course, if something significant happened as well, people would point to it and say, look, it's a sign of the end times. It was a hot topic, and Jesus' disciples asked him about it. This discussion is prompted by their visit to the temple. This had been refurbished by Herod the Great over a period of about 10 years, from around 20 BCE to 10 BCE, into this magnificent monument. The Temple Mount, as we saw in the previous aerial photograph from earlier in the lesson, it was turned into this large square platform with stones weighing over 100 tons. The biggest that we still have around today is what's known as the Western Stone, which you can see on the screen there. It measures 13.6 metres long by 3 metres high by 3.6 metres deep, and it weighs over 500 tonnes. No wonder the disciples were impressed. This place was amazing and beautiful and huge. But Jesus uses the disciples' interest as a teaching moment at the beginning of Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him and called his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Now, we've already discussed the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus Caesar in 70 CE earlier in this lesson, so I won't describe it again. But this speaking about catastrophic destruction brings to the disciples' minds the signs of the end times. And it introduces a segment that many commentators call Jesus' little apocalypse or little book of Revelation, because it deals with the age to come. The first lesson that Jesus teaches about the end times is to be careful labeling things as the end times. Continuing on in Matthew 24. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answered, Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumours of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen. End is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginnings of birth pains. See, Jesus is saying that, life can be generally terrible, or particularly awful things can happen. But this does not mean that it's the end of the world. In the 80s, the Cold War was on, and everyone was afraid that the end would come in a hellish nuclear firestorm as the Soviets and the Americans sought to obliterate each other with nuclear weapons. When the World Trade Center was attacked in 2001, that was supposed to be a sign of the end of the age, and yet here we all still are. COVID-19 is killing people all over the world, and I can bet you that there are people out there saying that this is the end times. People will use their knowledge that the end times are a thing to deceive people, so we need to be on our guard, that we shouldn't panic because bad things are happening. We need to be sensible about when we hear bad things happening. But mostly we should be trusting God, as Jesus will explain more a little bit later. Secondly, the lead up to the end times will see persecution of Christians. And we need to remember here that with the arrival of Jesus, the age of God's kingdom has already partially come in. We are living in the end times. Continuing on in Matthew 24. Then you'll be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, says Jesus. And you'll be hated by all nations because of me. At that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Whoever said that being a Christian was easy, or that by becoming a Christian nothing bad will now happen to you, clearly hasn't read scripture. Persecution is something that we see happening very early in the history of the church, as we'll find out in the book of Acts. And it's a factor that has never left. Today, Christians are the most persecuted group of people in the world. You all did a workshop that looked at that fact in the last lesson. But again, we can see Jesus is encouraging his followers. Don't be afraid, but stand firm to the end. Jesus also circles back to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem and the disastrous time that will be, evoking the image of the desolating sacrilege from Daniel. Let's just continue on with Matthew. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Little editorial note there by Matthew. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the fields go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Messiah," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, "There he is out in the wilderness," do not go out, or "Here he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. The desecration of the temple by the Babylonians when they invaded Judah, and then again when Antiochus Epiphanes outlawed Judaism, loomed very large in Jewish memory. It was the ultimate defeat to have the location of your faith and your very identity nullified in such a way. And sieges are terrible things, especially for vulnerable people like pregnant women, and it would be especially hard during times when food is low, like on a Sabbath or in winter. And we also see here again that there will be false claims about the Messiah. But Jesus is here to give them real hope, even in the midst of such a terrible time. Just like in Revelation, Jesus is telling his disciples, and is telling us, all these things not to focus on what happens, but rather to encourage us to persevere in the faith despite the terrible things that might happen around us, or even the terrible things that might happen to you. And this is no idle promise, as Jesus encourages his followers with a future hope. Immediately after the distress in those days, still continuing in Matthew, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to Now we have to remember here that whenever prophets look into the future to see these kinds of things, it's not clear to them at that moment which acts of judgment occur when. Jesus sees the destruction of Jerusalem, the persecution of the church, and his return. It all seems to be occurring at the same moment, although these will take place at different times, clearly. But we should also remember that the emphasis here is on warning the disciples and giving them hope. It is not on giving them details as to when this will happen and in what order. It's this message that was important to the early church living under persecution, as well as for us who are waiting impatiently for Jesus' return. We need to focus on our attitude rather than wanting to know the real picture of what happened and all the details. That stuff isn't important. So what should be the Christian attitude and response to our knowledge of the end times? Well, Jesus encourages his disciples firstly to be watchful, because the end times will come when they're least expected. But there will be signs that give it away, if you're looking out for them. This time we'll turn to Mark 13. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree, says Jesus. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, you know that it is near, the age to come, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. But about the day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, be alert. You do not know when that time will come. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with their assigned task, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know when the owner of the house will come back, whether in the evening or at midnight or when the rooster crows or at dawn. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. This is very helpful to Christians in the first century. According to the ancient historian Eusebius, when the Roman army was coming against Jerusalem, the Christians all left because they had remembered Jesus' words from 30 years before about the destruction of Jerusalem. It may well be a while before Jesus returns, but that does not mean that we should just forget all about him and let our lives return to normal or return to looking exactly like everyone else's life. Jesus' return is a sure thing that will happen, so we should be ready for it. This exhortation to remain ready and faithful is made clear in the parable of the 10 bridesmaids that Matthew records. This is in chapter 25. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him!" Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were on their way to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later, the others also came. "Lord, Lord," they said, "open the door for us." But he replied, "Truly I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." Now, this is actually a really odd response from a bridegroom. Why would you shut out your friends who you had invited to the wedding? Ordinarily you would be like, "Oh, you're late, but come in." But Jesus gives us an unexpected ending to draw attention to it. This situation is far more important than just an ordinary wedding. Being a follower of Jesus means always living your life in the knowledge and expectation that Jesus will return soon. You live your life in the here and now, but with one eye on the future. But Matthew goes further in his gospel. Not only should Jesus' followers be watchful and ready, but in light of the coming kingdom and in light of Jesus' return, they should always remain faithful and obedient. That's what being ready means. It's what it involves. Firstly, the parable of the unfaithful slaves compares the slave who slacks off because the master isn't there with the slave who continues to work hard even though he's not being directly supervised. Secondly, we have the parable of the bridesmaids, which we've already looked at, which combines watchfulness and faithfulness together. You can read these for yourselves. Matthew chapter 25, read it for yourself. It's really good stuff. Thirdly, we have the parable of the talents. Now, a talent is a measure of weight of about 25 kilograms. It would vary over time and place about how much it weighed, but it was the biggest measure of weight around. This is the parable of the talents that we read in Mark 25, tiny on the screen, so follow along in your Bibles. Matthew 25, I'm beginning at verse 14. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I've gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I've gained 2 more. The master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well then, you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. For whoever has will be given more, and they will have in abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Clearly the NIV translation, which is the one that I'm using at the moment, has translated talent into bag of gold, so that it actually makes sense for a modern reader. Because otherwise you'd be like, what on earth is a talent? But this parable is where we get the idea of a talent meaning being good at something. That's where that idea comes from. God has given us all certain gifts and abilities, and he asks that we use them for his glory. And it doesn't matter what we're given, whether it's 5 bags or 2, what your gift looks like. If we're faithful, then we receive praise and reward. If we're not using what God has given us for his glory, but keeping our talents hidden, then the question arises, do we even follow God at all? Note that this parable of the talents shouldn't be confused with the parable of the minas in Luke. Again, a mina is a measure of weight. There were 60 minas in a talent. They're very similar, but have important differences. This is in Luke chapter 19. Again, very small on the screen. I'm starting from verse 11. So Luke chapter 19, verse 11. While they were listening to this, he went on to tell them a parable because he was near Jerusalem, and the people thought that the kingdom of God was going to appear at once. He said, "A man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. So he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas. 'Put this money to work,' he said, 'until I come back.' But his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, 'We don't want this man to be our king.' He was made king, however, and returned home. Then he sent for the servants to whom he had given the money in order to find out what they had gained with it. The first one came and said, 'Sir, your mina has earned 10 more.' 'Well done, my good servant,' his master replied. 'Because you've been trustworthy in a very small matter, take charge of 10 cities. The second came and said, 'Sir, your mina has earned 5 more.' His master answered, 'You take charge of 5 cities. Then another servant came and said, 'Sir, here is your mina. I've kept it laid away in a piece of cloth. I was afraid of you because you are a hard man. Take out what you did not put in and reap what you did not sow.' His master replied, 'I will judge you by your own words, you wicked servant. You knew, did you, that I am a hard man, taking out what I did not put in and reaping back what I did not sow? Why then didn't you put the money on deposit so that when I came back I could have it collected with interest?' Then he said to those standing by, 'Take his mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas.' 'Sir,' they said, 'he already has 10. He replied, 'I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away. But those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me.'" So you can see how very similar these two parables are. But what's the difference? Well, the difference is that Luke has 2 plot points going on. One is the same story as we have in the parable of the talents, but then there is also this plot about the king who goes off to be crowned in a different country. And this reflects an account that we read in Josephus about Herod Archelaus. You might remember he was one of the tetrarchs after Herod the Great. He went off to crown king under their authority in around 4 BCE. His opponents sent representatives to Rome to say they didn't want him to be king, but they weren't listened to, and on his return he put 3,000 of those opponents to death. So this was a thing that actually happened, but Jesus is using it parabolically, as a parable, to make his further point. It's important for us to remember the context of Luke 19. What's going on here? Well, this is a little back further than the teachings that we've been looking at so far in this lesson. Here Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's about to go to begin his kingdom through his crucifixion, which exemplifies that his rule is one that is violently opposed, like the king in the Luke parable. So this parable is not only about being faithful with what God has given you, it's also about your acceptance of Jesus' authority over you. It is also in this way a condemnation of the Jewish leaders, as well as their followers, who will oppose Jesus. They had been given an amazing gift by being part of God's chosen people and by being heirs to his promises, but they had done nothing with this gift, and in fact rejected God's Saviour. And this brings us to our workshop questions for this week. It's a series of questions to actually get you to think about your own gifts. So the following questions: what do you see as your gift or gifts? They may be spiritual gifts. There are examples on 1 Corinthians 12. Remember, always these lists of gifts that you find in Paul's letters aren't exhaustive. This isn't, you can have these gifts and no other gifts. These are just examples. So you could have these sorts of spiritual gifts or other natural talents, like you're awesome at music, for example. So what do you see as your gift or gifts? How do you use these gifts to glorify God and serve others? And if this is the first time you thought about this, How do you think you could use your gifts in the future? How would you envisage using them in your church or in another ministry? How can you serve others and God with these gifts? Then, do you have the opportunity to express your gifts? If yes, what do those opportunities look like? If no, what or who is stopping you? So perhaps you have a gift of preaching and your church has you on the preaching roster, which is great. Perhaps you feel like you have the gift of preaching, but your church won't let you preach because you haven't got a certain qualification or something like that, for example. And then finally, what does your church do to help people discover their gifts and give them opportunities to use them? Now, this can be quite a difficult question. For some people, they are very clearly gifted in some way, and you can point at them and say, yes, you have the gift of administration, or you are great at having people over and entertaining them. You have the gift of hospitality. You're awesome at that. You serve people with that. That can be very easy. Sometimes it's not so easy, and people can struggle for ages with discovering what their gift might be. So, for example, I was a very shy child, very shy adult anyway, and so being that shy, I wasn't aware that I had the gift of teaching until I was given the opportunity to do that. Your church help people discover their gifts or encourage them in that path and giving them the opportunity to share those gifts. That's your workshop. For some of you, this will be quite easy because you're aware of your gifts, you've been encouraged and mentored and all that sort of thing. For some others of you, it might be a little more difficult. You might have to do a bit more soul searching. And for some of you, you might think you have a certain gift or want a certain gift, but you are actually starting to discover that your strengths might lie elsewhere. That will be a very interesting exploration for you to have. So I encourage you in that workshop. Now, this section of teaching is rounded off in Matthew with a description of Jesus' final judgment. We're still in Matthew 25. I'm starting at verse 31 in case the font is too small on your screen. Jesus is continuing teaching. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." Some echoes of the Good Samaritan in here, which is cool. Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or needing clothes, or sick or in prison, and did not help you?" He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. Of the nations was a traditional motif in Jewish eschatology. Throughout the Old Testament, prophets we see the nations are judged in a negative sense because they've either attacked Israel or benefited from its downfall at the hands of others. And here again we see that same motif. This time though, it is Jesus who is judging. And this is important because judgment is meted out based on the reaction of these people to his servants, and by extension himself. As the message of the gospel spreads throughout the world, everyone has a chance to embrace the messengers and their message, or not. This is demonstrated by their behaviour. The rewards for embracing the gospel is wonderful. The inheritance that God has in store for his people is now theirs, but the punishment is equally terrible. Mission is a vital part of Matthew's theological angle, as we'll see at the end of this book. And mission is also vital to the church. It is how the church grows. And so the gospel should be spreading out to all the nations, whom Jesus will judge. But we also see here again, people's true attitudes are revealed in their actions. Do they really follow God? Do they value Jesus and who he is? And that's expressed in how they behave towards Christians, and when they become Christians, towards their brothers and sisters. Let's just recap on what we've learned about the age to come through Jesus' teachings in this section. The emphasis here is on future hope. Not so much exactly details of what things will happen, but in the knowledge of the kinds of things that would happen, the hope that we should have. The future is uncertain and will certainly involve some terrible things, particularly persecution, as Jesus' message and authority is often violently opposed. There's also a threat that people will capitalize on people's fear about the future and uncertainty about the end times for their own gain. But Jesus tells us that we should not be afraid. We should be watchful and wise. Just because something terrible happens doesn't necessarily mean that the end is coming. And we should also be obedient, using the gifts that God has given us to glorify him and help others, especially fellow believers. We trust that God has the future in his control, and that we worship the one who will judge the world in justice. And that's an encouraging thought. So the second question for our lesson is, what gives you hope as you go through difficult times? What is it about Jesus and his message that has helped you through difficult times in the past? How does it do that? Remember, answers in the comments section below, and hopefully we can encourage one another through our own experiences of Jesus' hope and love and care and encouragement within us. That brings us to the end of our lesson. So thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for our next video where we'll closely examine Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, which will actually bring us to the end of the Gospels. Stay safe out there, and remember that God made you special, and he loves you very much.